Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The fog rolled thick across San Francisco Bay on the morning of June 12, 1962, carrying with it the smell of salt and secrets. Inside the concrete fortress of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, Corrections Officer Bill Long made his routine morning count through cell block B. His footsteps echoed against the cold stone walls as he moved from cell to cell, his flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. When he reached cell 138, he stopped. Something wasn't right. The figure in the bed didn't move when the light hit it. Long had been working at Alcatraz for 7 years, and he knew the difference between a sleeping inmate and something else entirely. He banged his nightstick against the bars. Nothing. His heart began to race as he fumbled for his keys. The metal clanged against the lock as he yanked open the cell door and grabbed what he thought was a shoulder. The head rolled backward, revealing not flesh and bone, but papier-mâché and human hair. A dummy. A decoy. Cell 138 was empty. Long's whistle pierced the morning air, sharp and urgent. Within seconds, the entire cell block erupted into chaos. Sirens wailed. Guards flooded the corridors. Warden Olin Blackwell arrived within minutes, his face pale as he stared at the crude dummy lying in Frank Morris's bed. But Morris wasn't the only one missing. Cells 140 and 142 stood equally empty. The Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, were gone too. 3 of America's most dangerous criminals had vanished from the most secure prison ever built. Frank Lee Morris was no ordinary convict. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, he'd already escaped from multiple prisons across the country. With an IQ of 133, Morris was a criminal genius who saw patterns where others saw only walls. His partners, John and Clarence Anglin, were bank robbers from Florida with their own impressive escape history. Together, they'd been planning something that everyone said was impossible. They'd been planning to escape from the Rock. Alcatraz wasn't just any prison. Built on a 12-acre island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, it was designed to be escape-proof. The water surrounding it was freezing, averaging 50 degrees year-round. The currents were treacherous, capable of pulling even the strongest swimmer under within minutes. Sharks patrolled the deeper waters. The prison housed America's most dangerous criminals, men like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz. In its 29 years of operation, no one had ever successfully escaped. At least, that's what everyone believed until that June morning. As guards tore through the cells, they began piecing together the scope of the operation. In Morris's cell, they found a gaping hole behind the air vent, roughly 10 inches wide. The concrete around it had been chipped away, bit by bit, over months. Maybe years. The Anglin brothers' cells showed the same modifications. But how had they done it? And how had no one noticed? The answer lay in the prison's own maintenance records. Months earlier, the inmates had been given access to tools for a routine repair project. Morris, ever the opportunist, had stolen a chrome-plated spoon from the dining hall. Using the spoon's metal and moisture from the bay air, he'd slowly corroded the concrete around the vents. The process was painstaking and nearly silent. Every night, while guards made their rounds, Morris and the Anglins chipped away at their escape route, hiding the debris in their pockets and dumping it during recreation time. But the holes were just the beginning. Behind the cells ran a utility corridor, 3 feet wide and unguarded. The inmates had discovered it during their reconnaissance. From there, they could access the prison's ventilation system. They'd crawled through the ductwork to the roof, removing a ventilation fan and creating an exit point to the outside world. The planning was meticulous. The execution was flawless. Almost. On the night of June 11th, the 3 men had put their plan into motion. They'd placed the dummy heads, crafted from soap, toilet paper, and real hair stolen from the barber shop, into their beds. They'd arranged the blankets to create the illusion of sleeping bodies. Then, one by one, they'd squeezed through the holes in their cells and disappeared into the darkness of the utility corridor. By the time Warden Blackwell assembled his team in the administration building, the scope of the escape was becoming clear. The inmates hadn't just slipped through a hole in the wall. They'd orchestrated something far more elaborate. In a storage area above the cell block, investigators found a makeshift workshop. Raincoats had been stitched together to create a life raft and life vests. Wooden paddles lay abandoned in the corner. Contact cement, stolen from the prison workshop, had been used to seal the seams. The men had even created a bellows from an accordion to inflate their raft once they hit the water. The FBI arrived by noon, led by Special Agent in Charge Frank Price. He stood on the prison's north shore, staring out at the bay, trying to calculate where 3 men on a makeshift raft might have gone. The currents that night had been particularly strong, pulling toward the Golden Gate Bridge and the open ocean beyond. The water temperature had been 54 degrees. Without proper gear, hypothermia would set in within 30 minutes. Even with their crude life vests, the odds of survival seemed impossibly slim. But Price had learned never to underestimate desperate men. He ordered a massive search operation. Coast Guard cutters swept the bay. Police helicopters circled overhead. Officers combed the shorelines of San Francisco, Marin County, and the East Bay. They found pieces of the raft washed up near Angel Island. They found a paddle floating near Alcatraz. But they found no bodies. And more troubling still, they found no trace of Morris or the Anglin brothers. As darkness fell on June 12, the nation learned of the escape. Newspapers across the country ran the story on their front pages. Television news broadcasts showed aerial footage of Alcatraz, the fortress that had failed. The public was both terrified and fascinated. 3 dangerous criminals were on the loose, and no one knew where they'd gone. In the prison's control room, Agent Price examined a piece of evidence that had been discovered in the utility corridor. It was a handwritten note, hidden beneath a loose tile. The handwriting belonged to Frank Morris. It contained coordinates, numbers that didn't immediately make sense. But Price had a sinking feeling he knew what they meant. They weren't map coordinates. They were tide tables. Morris had been calculating the perfect night to escape, the night when the currents would carry them not toward the ocean, but toward the eastern shore of the bay. Price looked up at the map on the wall, his finger tracing an invisible line from Alcatraz to the Oakland shoreline. If Morris had timed it right, if they'd caught the current at precisely the right moment, they could have made it. They could actually be alive. But when they opened the locked basement door beneath the prison's dock, searching for any additional evidence the inmates might have left behind, what they found changed everything. The basement beneath Alcatraz's dock was a place most guards tried to avoid. It was dark, damp, and filled with the sounds of water lapping against stone foundations. Agent Price descended the narrow stairs with 2 corrections officers flanking him, their flashlights cutting through the blackness. The air smelled of mildew and rust, decades of decay compressed into a space that felt more like a tomb than part of a functioning prison. Price's flashlight beam swept across the floor, and that's when he saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the layer of dust and grime that covered the concrete. 3 sets, leading from a gap in the foundation wall toward a stack of old supply crates near the water's edge. His pulse quickened. The inmates had been here. Recently. Behind the crates, they found more evidence of the escape plan. Empty food tins, carefully hidden. A compass, likely stolen from the prison's education department. Most disturbing of all was a small calendar, scratched into the stone wall with what appeared to be a piece of metal. Dates had been crossed off, one by one, for 18 months. This wasn't a spontaneous escape. Morris and the Anglin brothers had been planning this since the day they'd arrived at Alcatraz. But something else caught Price's attention. Tucked into a crack in the wall was a photograph, water-damaged but still visible. It showed a woman, probably in her 30s, standing in front of a car. On the back, written in faded pencil, were the words, Mary, 1960, Tampa. Price carefully placed the photograph into an evidence bag. The Anglin brothers were from Florida. This had to be connected. By the second day of the investigation, the search had expanded across 3 states. FBI field offices in California, Florida, and Georgia were working around the clock, following leads that ranged from credible to completely absurd. A gas station attendant in Marin County reported seeing 3 men matching the inmates' descriptions buying food at 2 in the morning on June 12. A fisherman near the Golden Gate Bridge claimed he'd seen a makeshift raft with 3 men paddling frantically toward land. But none of the leads produced concrete evidence. In Florida, FBI agents descended on the Anglin family farm in Ruskin. The brothers' mother, Rachel Anglin, was a weathered woman in her 60s who answered the door with suspicious eyes and tight lips. She denied knowing anything about the escape. She denied receiving any contact from her sons. But when agents searched the property, they found something that made them pause. In the barn, hidden beneath hay bales, was a bundle of men's clothing. New clothing, still with the tags attached. 3 sets. 3 sizes that would fit John, Clarence, and Frank Morris perfectly. Rachel Anglin was brought in for questioning. For hours, she sat across from Agent Price in a small interrogation room in Tampa, her hands folded on the table, her expression never changing. She maintained her innocence. Her sons hadn't contacted her. She knew nothing about the clothes. But Price noticed something during their conversation. Every time he mentioned a specific date, June 15, 3 days after the escape, Rachel's eye twitched. Just slightly. Just enough. Price pulled phone records for the Anglin farm. On June 15, at 3:17 in the morning, a collect call had been placed to the farm from a payphone in San Francisco. The call lasted 47 seconds. When confronted with this evidence, Rachel's story finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted that yes, she'd received a call. But she swore she didn't know where her sons were calling from. They'd only said one thing. "We made it, Mama. Don't worry about us." Then the line went dead. Back in San Francisco, the investigation took another turn. A clerk at a bus station near Fisherman's Wharf came forward with information. On the morning of June 12, around 5 a.m., 3 men had purchased tickets to Seattle. The clerk remembered them because they were soaking wet, their clothes dripping water onto the station floor. They'd paid in cash, small bills that looked worn and old. When shown photographs of Morris and the Anglin brothers, the clerk's identification was positive. It was them. Price immediately contacted the Seattle field office. Agents began canvassing bus stations, hotels, and known criminal safe houses throughout the city. But it was like chasing smoke. Every lead evaporated upon investigation. A hotel clerk thought maybe he'd seen them. A bartender remembered 3 men who matched the description. But no one could provide anything definitive. Morris and the Anglins had become ghosts. Meanwhile, forensic teams at Alcatraz were reconstructing the escape minute by minute. They determined that the inmates had likely entered the water around 11 p.m. on June 11. The raft, crudely constructed but surprisingly functional, would have held their weight if they'd been careful. The current that night would have carried them northeast, exactly as Morris had calculated. If they'd paddled hard and caught the tide at the right moment, they could have reached the shoreline near the Berkeley Marina in under 2 hours. But there was a problem with this theory. At 11:30 that night, a commercial fishing vessel had been operating in that exact area. The captain and his crew had been questioned extensively. None of them had seen a raft. None of them had seen 3 men in the water. So either the inmates had been incredibly lucky, or they'd gone a different direction entirely. Agent Price studied the tide charts and current patterns obsessively. He consulted with Coast Guard experts and oceanographers from the University of California. Everyone told him the same thing. In those conditions, with that equipment, the men should have drowned. The odds of survival were less than 5%. But Price had learned to distrust odds. Criminals like Frank Morris didn't operate based on probability. They operated based on preparation and opportunity. 3 weeks into the investigation, another piece of evidence surfaced. A woman in Vancouver, Canada reported seeing 3 American men at a hostel near the waterfront. They checked in under false names and paid cash for a week's stay. They kept to themselves, rarely leaving their room except to buy food. When the woman saw the wanted posters that had been distributed across the Pacific Northwest, she immediately recognized the faces. But by the time Canadian authorities arrived at the hostel, the men were gone. They'd checked out 2 days earlier, leaving no forwarding address. The international dimension of the escape changed everything. Price coordinated with Interpol and Canadian law enforcement, expanding the dragnet across North America. But Morris and the Anglins were always one step ahead. It was as if they knew exactly where to go, exactly how to avoid detection. Price began to suspect they'd had help on the outside, a network of contacts providing safe houses and false documents. Back at Alcatraz, investigators made another discovery. In the prison library, hidden inside a hollowed-out book, they found detailed notes about offshore banking and international travel. Morris had been researching how to disappear permanently, how to establish new identities, how to move money without leaving a trace. The notes included information about countries with no extradition treaties, remote locations where Americans could live without attracting attention. The notes included information about countries with no extradition treaties, remote locations where Americans could live without attracting attention. One name appeared repeatedly in Morris's notes. Brazil. Specifically, a small coastal town called Parody, known for its isolation and its history of welcoming outsiders who didn't ask too many questions. Price sent a cable to the American embassy in Rio de Janeiro, requesting surveillance of the region. But he knew the chances of finding 3 men in a country the size of Brazil were infinitesimally small. As summer turned to fall, the investigation began to lose momentum. The FBI had conducted over 8,000 interviews. They'd followed hundreds of leads across a dozen states and 3 countries. They'd spent countless hours analyzing evidence, reconstructing timelines, and developing theories. But they were no closer to finding Morris and the Anglin brothers than they'd been on day 1. Then, on October 17, 1962, 4 months after the escape, a package arrived at the FBI's San Francisco field office. It had no return address and bore a postmark from Mexico City. Inside was a single photograph showing 3 men sitting at an outdoor cafe, their faces partially obscured by sunglasses and hats. The quality was poor, the image grainy, but the resemblance was unmistakable. On the back of the photograph, written in handwriting that matched Frank Morris's prison records, was a single sentence. "Thanks for the hospitality, but the rock wasn't really our style." Price stared at the photograph for a long time, his jaw clenched in frustration and, if he was honest with himself, a grudging respect. Morris had done it. They'd all done it. They'd escaped from Alcatraz, survived the bay, and disappeared into the world. But as Price was about to file the photograph as evidence, he noticed something in the background of the image. Something that would reopen the entire investigation and reveal a truth far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The detail Agent Price noticed was almost invisible, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. In the background of the photograph, barely visible behind the three men at the cafe, was a street sign. The letters were blurry, but with enhancement, they became readable. Avenida Insurgentes. A major thoroughfare in Mexico City. But that wasn't what made Price's blood run cold. Reflected in the cafe window behind the men was another figure, someone who appeared to be taking the photograph. And in that reflection, Price could make out a face he recognized. It was Allen West. Allen West was the fourth man. The inmate everyone had forgotten about. West had been part of the escape plan from the beginning, his cell located right next to Morris's in cell block B. He'd helped chip away at the concrete, helped steal the materials, helped construct the raft. But on the night of the escape, West's ventilation grate had been sealed with cement that hadn't fully dried. By the time he'd managed to break through, Morris and the Anglins were gone. West had been left behind, and he'd been the one who'd eventually told investigators everything about the plan. Or so everyone thought. Price immediately pulled West's prison records and visitation logs. West was still incarcerated at Alcatraz, serving out his sentence. But something didn't add up. If West had been bitter about being left behind, why would he be in Mexico City taking photographs of his former partners? Unless he hadn't been left behind at all. Unless his capture had been part of the plan from the start. Price rushed to Alcatraz and demanded to see West immediately. The guards brought him to the interrogation room, and for the first time, Price looked at Allen West not as a failed escapee but as a potential accomplice who'd played everyone. West sat down with his characteristic smirk, the same expression he'd worn during dozens of previous interviews. "Allen, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to be honest with me," Price said, sliding the photograph across the table. "How did you take this picture when you're supposed to be locked in this prison?" West's smirk faltered for just a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a sound without humor, cold and calculated. "You people," he said, shaking his head. "You really thought I was stupid enough to get left behind by accident?" The truth spilled out over the next 6 hours. West had been the mastermind behind the psychological operation. His job was to stay behind, to appear to be the failed escapee, to provide just enough information to make the story believable but not enough to actually help catch Morris and the Anglins. He'd fed investigators carefully curated details, sending them chasing leads in all the wrong directions while his partners established themselves in new lives abroad. But more shocking was what West revealed about the escape itself. They hadn't used the raft. Not the way everyone thought. The crude life raft made from raincoats had been a decoy, deliberately left where it would be found. The real escape vehicle had been hidden for months in a maintenance shed on the island's north shore. A small motorboat, stolen piece by piece from the prison's dock over the course of a year and reassembled in secret. On the night of June 11th, Morris and the Anglins had used the boat to motor across the bay to a pre-arranged pickup point in Sausalito. Waiting for them had been a woman named Mary Henriksen, the same woman from the photograph found in the basement. She wasn't just a girlfriend of the Anglins. She was a former nurse who'd been corresponding with Morris for years, smuggling money and information through coded letters. She'd rented a house in Marin County, stockpiled supplies, and arranged for false documents. When the three men arrived that night, soaking wet but very much alive, she'd driven them to a safe house in Oregon. West explained the phone call to the Anglin farm. It had been part of a carefully orchestrated misdirection campaign. They'd wanted authorities to think they'd called from San Francisco, to keep the search focused on the West Coast. In reality, by the time that call was made, Morris and the Anglins were already in Canada, preparing to cross into Mexico with Mary's help. The bus station sighting, the Vancouver hostel, even the clothing found at the Anglin farm, all of it had been staged. West had partners on the outside, other inmates who'd been released in the months before the escape. They'd been paid to appear in public places, to be seen, to create a trail that led nowhere. The real Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin had taken a completely different route south through California into Mexico, traveling at night and avoiding major cities entirely. Price felt the investigation crumbling around him. Everything they'd believed, every lead they'd followed, had been part of an elaborate deception. "Where are they now?" he demanded. West shrugged. Brazil, last I heard. But they were talking about Argentina. Maybe Chile. Somewhere they could disappear. Frank always said the best way to hide wasn't to run but to become someone else entirely. By now, they've got new names, new lives, new histories. You'll never find them. The FBI launched a renewed investigation based on West's confession, but it was too late. The trail had gone cold. Interpol searched throughout South America but found nothing. Mary Henriksen had vanished as completely as the inmates themselves. The motorboat was never recovered. The safe houses West described had been abandoned and cleaned, leaving no forensic evidence. In December 1962, 6 months after the escape, the United States Marshals Service officially took over the investigation. Alcatraz itself was showing its age, the cost of operation becoming unsustainable. The prison that had once been America's symbol of inescapable justice had been beaten by 3 men with determination, intelligence, and meticulous planning. On March 21, 1963, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was officially closed. The remaining inmates were transferred to other facilities. Allen West was sent to the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he continued to serve his sentence. He never revealed any additional information about Morris and the Anglins, maintaining until his death in 1978 that they'd successfully escaped and built new lives somewhere beyond the reach of American law. Agent Frank Price retired from the FBI in 1975, but he never stopped thinking about the case. In his home office, he kept a wall dedicated to the Alcatraz escape, photographs and maps and notes covering every inch. He spent his retirement years following up on rumors and alleged sightings. A man in Rio who looked like Frank Morris. 2 brothers running a fishing business in Argentina who might have been the Anglins. But none of the leads ever produced proof. Over the decades, the FBI received numerous letters claiming to be from the escapees. Most were obvious hoaxes, attention seekers looking for their 15 minutes of fame. But a few were different. In 1975, a letter arrived at the San Francisco field office, postmarked from São Paulo, Brazil. It contained specific details about the escape that had never been made public, information only someone who'd been there could know. The letter claimed that Morris and John Anglin were alive and well, living under assumed names. Clarence Anglin, it said, had died of pneumonia in 1965, his body buried in an unmarked grave in the Brazilian countryside. The handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The information could have come from someone with inside knowledge, or it could have been an elaborate fake. The FBI investigated but found nothing concrete. The case remained open, officially unsolved, a permanent black mark on the Bureau's record. In 2013, another letter surfaced, this one even more specific. It claimed to be from John Anglin himself, now in his 80s and dying of cancer. He wrote that he wanted to negotiate a deal, to come home and spend his final days in America in exchange for reduced sentences. He provided a photograph of himself, aged but recognizable, holding a recent newspaper. The FBI investigated, analyzing the photograph and the handwriting. The results were tantalizing but not definitive. The man in the photograph could have been John Anglin, but he could also have been any number of elderly men with similar features. No deal was ever struck. No one ever came forward. The investigation remained open, technically active but essentially dormant. The United States Marshals Service still maintains wanted posters for Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. They would be in their 90s now if they're still alive, old men living out their final years under names that aren't their own, in places that don't ask questions about the past. Alcatraz Island is now a tourist attraction, visited by over 1 million people each year. They walk through cell block B, staring at cells 138, 140, and 142. They see the holes behind the ventilation grates, carefully preserved. They marvel at the dummy heads, still displayed in the prison museum. Tour guides tell the story of the Great Escape, the only successful escape in Alcatraz's history. They talk about the odds of survival, the freezing water, the treacherous currents. They tell visitors that Morris and the Anglins probably drowned, that their bodies were swept out to sea, never to be recovered. But sometimes, late at night when the tourists have gone and the fog rolls in thick across the bay, the guards who maintain the island swear they can feel a presence in those empty cells. A sense that someone is still there, still planning, still calculating the odds. The ghost of Frank Morris, perhaps, or the echo of 3 men who refused to accept that any prison could hold them. The official FBI position remains unchanged. Frank Lee Morris, John William Anglin, and Clarence Anglin are presumed dead, victims of their own desperate gamble against nature. But in a locked file cabinet in the basement of the San Francisco field office, there's a folder that tells a different story. It contains the photographs, the letters, the evidence that suggests something impossible. That 3 men beat the system. That they escaped from the rock and lived to tell about it, even if they could never tell their story publicly. They thought the killer was behind bars. But in this case, there was no killer, only men who refused to be caged. And somewhere, in a small town in South America, or on a quiet farm in the countryside, or in a coastal village where no one asks your real name, 3 old men might be sitting on a porch, watching the sunset, and remembering the night they proved that even Alcatraz couldn't hold them. The night they became legends. The night they disappeared into history and never looked back. If you think this story was intense, the truth is even more mysterious than you can imagine. Real mysteries, real escapes, real criminals who changed history. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because some stories are too incredible to be forgotten.